Provel Politics, the podcast for progressives living in Trump country. I'm Reese.
And I'm Maggie.
And this is episode 1 of 1, maybe 1 of 2 or 3.
Or 100. We'll see how far we get.
It's going to be episode 1 of 1.
We are currently in the beautiful Richmond Heights Center. We went to a previous library, did not have a workroom, so we are dealing with what we've got, and we're excited to be here.
If I could describe the scene, we're at like a kitchen area. There's a sink and like a microwave.
The lighting's a bit odd, but
it was very dark when we came in here, and all this recording equipment, it looks like I'm carrying something dangerous, and I noticed people looking, but no one's in here, and this is a very big room, actually.
Yes.
Here we are. So let's just get started with who are we? Who are you, Maggie?
I am Maggie Hannock. I am 18. I just graduated from St. Joseph's Academy, and I will be going to College of the Holy Cross next year. It's in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I hear the Boston accents are strong.
Yes.
And I'm excited. I am happy to be finished with high school. I'm ready to go to college. And this is my second year interning at Civitas, and it's been a great time. And I'm excited to do this podcast to kind of hang out more with the famous, infamous Reese Ellis and discuss important things.
So, certainly very much infamous. I mean, if you only knew. So, I am going into my third year at Truman State. I went to Hayeswood East years and years ago, I guess. Wow. And this is my third year interning with Civitas, and so I am just glad to be still wanted around the office now that I'm getting older. I'm 20. I'm the oldest person in the office that is not official year-round staff.
But he is official staff. He's definitely
staff.
Higher than the intern status that I have.
Well, and you know, the funny thing about this podcast was it's been in the works for about a year.
Yes. We had the brilliant idea to start it last year and never executed it.
No.
So this year we're coming at it strong. It's not the end of June and we're halfway through the summer, but we're hoping to have a June edition as well as a July and August, and maybe a couple in July to keep it interesting.
Maybe we'll have guests in the future.
Yes.
I don't know who, but I'm sure we'll figure out who as we get to the end of this podcast, we figure out if this is episode 1 of 1 or 1 of 3.
And how long this episode might be. We might have some commercials here and there, or a special video segment at one point.
Currently, we have no sponsorships, but
yes,
who knows? But let's talk about our big idea, which is what should democracy look like, and how useful is activism? I know that you are an activist, and you do so many things. Like, I could name them all. You work with Moms Demand Action, and what is your gun group? Well, excuse me, you're not a gun group.
We are a common sense gun reform group. Students Demand Action.
Students Demand Action.
A branch of Moms.
And I do a lot of more electoral work, but so do you. You knock on a lot of doors. You get very tan in the summer.
Oh, or burnt.
And so, is any of what we're doing useful?
Well, I think we have an interesting pair here in that I, by definition, am an activist. I do a lot of chanting and marching and posting. I'm very much of an empath, and I kind of relate with people on the human rights level, so I'm very big into social issues. And I'm saying all of this with a grain of salt because I don't know how useful it is. I have gotten to the point where I know how useful action is, and activism without action is nothing. And so I know many people, and I used to be like this, that would just post and hope things got better or march, and that was the end of it. But now I've gotten more into the electoral policy and things like that, and I hope to go into policy to kind of make a difference. I respect Reese in that you do a lot of research and have the data behind it, which is as important, if not more.
Well, I mean, you know, everything, I would say that activism probably matters a little bit because as we learn about this in school, I have some professors who study Latin American politics, and that's a lot of protest culture. And protest does matter. I don't know if we've necessarily mastered it in this country, in this generation, in the way that it could be effective. But, you look at the media and you look at the type of things that our politicians talk about, and it's clear that what we do is affecting those conversations. But on the other hand, it's one thing for there to be a conversation versus there being policy that is what you're fighting for in the end, because if we all just agree on the same thing but nothing changes, is that effective activism? I don't know. We're kind of in the long game with all these things, because it's hard to go out and protest and then expect the next day for something to change. And we are both fairly young.
Yes. And
I'm 20, you're 18. It took longer than that for the civil rights movement to kind of come to fruition. So I think we'll see. We're kind of living in a weird moment right now.
Yes.
So we'll check back in 5 or 10 years and see if anything that we've done, the marching and the talking and the signs, affected anything. It certainly, I think it's affected us.
Yes,
made us more aware.
Definitely. I've seen that a lot in people my own age who are motivated by this, and that it just makes them feel better. And if we need that, we need that. And people need to feel better in this day and age. But I do think that it's important, and it helps all of us be active citizens to just care what's going on and do something about it. It's hard to see action immediately. And so it takes a lot of patience. We canvassed a lot we've had a streak of losing candidates,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate, but it takes a lot, and hopefully we'll get there.
So in a democracy, is activism a big part of that, or should it be? In like an ideal democracy, are there still protests, do you think?
I do. I don't think it's the forefront at all. It might be the forefront for ideas, to get the idea out there, but immediately it needs to translate into voting, meetings, forums, all of that. I often kind of compare activism to lobbying in a way, which lobbying gets a bad rep, and it's not all bad. Sure,
we're lobbyists for the public.
Exactly. And so I think that...
Which is what lobbyists would say.
Yeah, that's true too. But I think lobbying does have a place, and I'm not against it. And so I think that it just kind of puts a person to an issue and says like, hey, I stand up for this issue, let's fix it by this. And then having a means to fix that through democracy. So I think democracy can function better with activism, and we shouldn't neglect activists and their voices and what they want to do, but we need to kind of focus on the actual action that democracy can produce.
I completely agree. And sometimes, maybe that's why, maybe we need like someone who is like a conservative living in progressive country.
Yes.
As a counterpoint. I don't know any. If you do,
I met a
leave
man
a message.
from California once who was a conservative.
Was it Ronald Reagan?
No,
Okay.
it wasn't him. But we have this podcast so that we can talk about it, and we can hopefully get feedback and figure out what's the best way to live a progressive life. And that doesn't have to be politically progressive, just leading a life that...
Moving society forward.
Exactly.
In a way that makes humanity better. But let's talk about what's going on in the news. So we're going to work our way up. We're going to start locally, because we're Provel in politics.
Yes.
And if you don't know what that's a reference to, it's Provel cheese, because that's an emos thing. But I don't even think you like emos.
I don't love emos, but I will defend it. And
Okay.
the thing with emos is that I wouldn't say I eat a lot, but like I'll eat a couple pieces and still be hungry. And so it is our cracker crust, and I'm proud of it. I went to orientation in Massachusetts, and people thought that their pizza was thin, and I was like, oh no.
You don't know thin.
We have thinner pizza. And so we may have a special segment on Provel, the fakeness of it, but the authenticity of it, of St. Louis.
It adds to our culture.
It does.
But nevertheless,
Locally.
this is the week of Pride.
Yay!
There are a couple Pride. Well, there are a lot of different Prides. There's Tower Grove Pride, which is kind of like the original Pride, and then there's the downtown Pride, which is larger and has more corporate sponsorships.
Rainbow capitalism.
Rainbow capitalism. So what's happened recently is there was somewhat of a debacle, and this is a nationwide conversation about whether police officers who are in the LGBTQ plus community should be allowed to march in pride parades. And so originally, St. Louis Pride announced that gay and lesbian officers would not be allowed to march in the parade. And after about 10 days or so, Mayor Cruson and STL Pride came together and held a press conference and said that officers actually would be allowed to march in the Pride Parade. And because of that, the Grand Marshal of Pride has decided that they're not going to take part. And so there is a lot of feelings about this. I'll share mine, and maybe Maggie has a different view or the same. I don't think that police officers should be marching in Pride. The history of the LGBTQ plus community is one that has very fraught relationships with the police. You think about the Stonewall riots, and why were they riots? It was because the police came in to harass LGBTQ plus patrons, and so that's been the history of this community in this country, and so I think it's probably insensitive to include police officers, even if they are a part of the community. They can come and participate non-uniform, but I think it is asking a lot of that community to include the police in their celebration of their identity.
I think with the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, it's come up more in conversation.
Oh, it is the 50th.
Yes, and
wow.
I think it's important to be having this discussion on the national base, as well as St. Louis being part of it, because police can be triggering for a lot of people, especially because Pride started from the Stonewall riots. And recently I've seen so many advertisements, so many posts about Pride being a riot to start with. And so I think to keep that history and to just keep people from feeling comforted by the loving community that Pride offers, I don't think it's necessary to have police officers there. If they want to come, they can. They don't have to be in uniform. And we should just create Pride St. Louis to be an environment where anyone's welcome, but also that is not kind of painting a picture of we need police there to protect us because of the history that Pride has had with that. And I think that Tower Grove does a great job at hosting a Pride. I went downtown to Pride, and it was great. Again, that loving community, and the parade is everyone comes out. Well,
including
not everyone,
the banks and the corporations.
But yes,
and
but
everyone
it kind of, like, I'm glad that these banks and insurance companies and restaurants are all saying, like, yes, we stand with you, but I'd like to see that all year round, and we don't. And so I like Tower Grove because it's really those great organizations just all coming together and doing what they do always.
Yeah. And so moving on, Maggie, would you like to talk about this?
Yeah, just to kind of connect to the police and our city of St. Louis. As everyone knows, we kind of fluctuate on the high crime rates of St. Louis and in the country. And so recently, if you watch the news, I personally watch KSDK, and every night there's a recall of what happened that day, and it often involves a shooting. Recently, it's been children, a 6-year-old girl, a 15-year-old boy, both shot and killed. There's been many other incidents. Every weekend now we have 10 to 20 people who die on the streets of St. Louis. And so the police chief, John Hayden, he addressed this violence online, just saying that the department has responded to 3 toddlers being shot recently. In St. Louis, there is the Children's Hospital, which is the #1 hospital to treat children who have been shot. And so children also, their second largest, highest death cause is gun violence. And so I think St. Louis is part of that issue, and just that our gun violence culture is all around us, and people are walking down the streets and getting shot. And so while the police chief did have a video conference, that was great, and I think we need to have more conversations like that. The police are getting involved, the doctors are now out being outspoken about it. So I think it's just very apparent in our city that we need to just keep having these conversations and figure out this gun issue.
Yeah. You shared a TED Talk with our office today about gun violence as it relates to young people. And it is just one of those, overwhelming issues that kind of fatigue everyone because it is just so burdensome to hear about and live through. And there's so many deaths from gun violence every day now that I can't even keep up with them, especially in this city.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things that always concerns me is, whenever we have a political campaign, it always comes back to the violence in the city, and it ends up meaning that we ignore a lot of other issues.
Exactly.
And maybe some of those issues relate to the roots of the violence, like poverty and lack of opportunity, and some of the feelings of despair that grip people and drive them to violence. And a lot of gun deaths, of course, are accidents, but it's one of those things that's always hard to talk about and think about because there seems to be no will to do anything to quell the violence.
People talk about the root of the problem, which here, it's not a simple problem. That's what the TED Talk was about. It was about a teacher from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas who talked about how do we end this senseless violence. And one, can we just get along better? Or can we hold gun manufacturers responsible? Or can we fix the Second Amendment and the NRA lobby? And so it's not an easy problem to fix. There's too many guns for us to take them all and get rid of them. We live in a city also with police violence all the time. And so
we're famous for it.
Yes,
Ferguson,
unfortunately.
Yeah, and others.
Yes, and so I think it's important to kind of realize that guns can be the problem, or they can be the
symptom of
a larger problem.
Yeah.
So I think we, as a city, can really invest in helping the other problems to fix this horrible gun issue.
Yeah. So let's talk about the state of Missouri larger. We're moving up the news chain. So we have had an abortion debacle, to put it lightly, probably as lightly as possible.
Exactly.
Because it has been probably the most embarrassing thing to have happened to this state in the last few years, and that includes Eric Greitens.
Yeah.
R.I.P. So recently, this legislative session, a heartbeat bill was debated in the Missouri General Assembly. It was amended so it wouldn't be technically a heartbeat bill, which would be 6 weeks. Instead, it was 8 weeks. Oh boy. And that passed and was signed by Governor Parson. And pretty soon after that, the one abortion clinic that still exists in the state of Missouri, Planned Parenthood of St. Louis, had some trouble with renewing its license because the state was asking for some documentation and interviews from various healthcare professionals that seemed overly burdensome, considering that it seems like it's a new standard, didn't really exist before.
Creating new standards to pass.
Yes. And so finally it landed in court because the state was going to refuse to renew Planned Parenthood's license. And we're now at the point where there have been 2 court decisions, and currently Planned Parenthood has a stay to continue performing abortion in this state for now. It's still in court, and it's probably going to be arbitrated with the Department of Health and the other related parties, but we are probably on the road to being the first state since Roe v. Wade to not have an abortion clinic.
And this was around the same time of Alabama and Georgia.
And Ohio.
Yes. And name another couple. And we are in a national crisis of states repealing laws or trying to reverse Roe v. Wade in their own states. And so we've received a lot of news because it's hard for me and a lot of people in our generation to imagine life without Planned Parenthood or Roe v. Wade. But as this has come to light, people have been out speaking about Roe v. Wade prior to that. And so they've been talking about the back alley abortions and not having a Planned Parenthood for even just the simplest terms of healthcare, men's and women's physical and mental health. And so the standards that the state has put onto Planned Parenthood in order to close it is absurd. That is the embarrassment, as well as trying to get rid of all abortion access. And I was listening to a podcast about the Daily
Of course.
about Missouri's abortion laws and trying to close the one last abortion clinic, Planned Parenthood, in St. Louis on Forest Park Parkway. And Illinois has Hope Clinic. That's 20 minutes
in
from
Granite
us.
City.
Yes. And so, but if we just have that one in a different state, that's so limiting. And so we're just getting in this divisive argument that's bringing out the worst in people. I've seen a lot of bad things from both sides of just attacking people for their beliefs. And I think we need to get to a point where we have to see where the other side is coming and choose what's best for women and their choices.
And the other element to it is that this was passed almost on a party line. There was maybe one Democrat who voted for it, but they're known for being pro-life. And so there may be a pro-life majority in the state, or there may be a pro-choice majority in the state, but whatever the actual numbers is, whether it's 53-47 or 50-50, 49-49, there almost certainly is not a 70-30 pro-life majority in the state.
Exactly.
And so there is a question of what are our elected officials doing, because it doesn't seem like they're representing the will of Missouri at large, and seems to be pretty unpopular throughout the state. I've seen some polling, and it depends where you go. Some technical difficulties.
Slightly, yes.
But we're back. The larger point is Missouri politicians are out of touch with Missouri, and we're just going to have to do better.
And one point to add, when we talked about gun violence and the root of the problem being poverty or education or racism or sexism, I think this abortion issue can attribute to that. Women get abortions because they are impoverished. They have not received the education they need to. And so I think what we can do now here is make Missouri a state that cares for women and all of their needs before they have to get an abortion. Going along with Missouri, and on a lighter issue, we are in between two rivers, the Mississippi and the Missouri, and as climate change threatens our existence and becomes more of a reality, we are experiencing natural disasters from it. So our flooding here has been outrageous. Our crust have been so high with both of the rivers cresting, recordly and historically.
Yes.
And so one thing about this is that we've had so much rain too. And there are 2 points to that, is that this rain will cause all of these floods, and it really affects our grounds, our business, but also there have been multiple incidents of people dying from either drowning or having trees fall. And so this is very prevalent still in Missouri, and it's been interesting. This has been a summer of natural disasters, which we've had before, but I do think that we're in the midst of our climate change.
Yeah. And, some of this is also due to man-made development out in the rivers. The Missouri River, I've heard, actually used to be 10 times wider than it currently is, which is pretty big because it's already a very big river, and we're at,
10 times wider.
We've kept records of floods since the 1780s, and this summer was number 2 out of 200 and several, 280 years. So these floods aren't going to get better until we get better about our actions towards, river development and putting carbon in the air and making some of these storms we have more extreme. And a lot of this water was built up from the bad winter we had, which is also a result of climate change, because you have systems coming together and making these superstorms that produce a lot of weather. But
With climate change, it's becoming more of a topic, of course, and in previous presidential elections, we have yet to talk about climate change, but in this year's, the 2020 debates and the campaigns, it's one of the leading questions and policy plans. So, we are in the midst of Democratic Debate Night 1 and Democratic Debate Night 2.
Oh,
we are...
What a transition.
Yes, we are reflecting on what some of the candidates spoke last night and looking forward to tonight's.
Yes. Well, I'm going to start off with who I think had the best night. I think there were two people who had really good nights, and then one person who had an okay night, and then maybe we can go into who did not have a good night.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Julian Castro had a very good night.
I agree.
Because he is at about 0.5% in national polling, and all he needed to do was to sound informed, and he did. He did a very impassioned bit on immigration,
mm-hmm.
and he has policy. I think he and Beto O'Rourke are the only two who have laid out policies on immigration, and so I was impressed by that, and I think he was very convincing. He did have a dust-up with Beto, and everyone spoke a lot of Spanish last night.
Yes.
But other than him, I thought Elizabeth Warren did well because the expectations were set really high for her, and the moderators kept giving candidates a debate to attack her, and they didn't go for it. And so she came out unscathed, and she did her I have a plan thing. And I thought Bill de Blasio came out okay. His record in New York is spotty, but he gave a very good debate performance. He looks strong. He's very tall, 6'5", and that is its own presence on a stage. But that's who I noticed. Maggie, did you notice anyone last night?
I would say that I agree in that who did a strong performance was Elizabeth Warren and Castro, but I disagree with de Blasio. I think it was more of a power move in some ways, a little bit aggressive that I did not appreciate. I loved how Warren used her policy and her platform and hype and her name recognition to her advantage, and I loved how Castro involved his personal experiences as well as what he would do as president. I think they were very strong. I think they would be great candidates for president. I'm even thinking, what if they were on a ticket together?
Oh, wow.
But I think it was better than I thought. At times, I got overwhelmed. I was stressed out. There was too many and too much going on. A little heat here and there. But overall, I felt like they were very diplomatic. They kept the relationships solid, and it was okay.
In relation to who lost, I think there was one clear loser. Anyone else, you could argue they didn't do super well, but expectations were kind of low for them anyway, because if you're at 1%, and I think Beto did not perform well. So Beto was in the low single digits when he announced, and now he is at about 3%, 2%, 4%, depends where you look, doing slightly better in Iowa. And really, he needed to do well to kind of make a comeback narrative. And there's still a lot of time between now and the caucuses, but his Spanish answer for tax policy, where he didn't really answer the question, it didn't behoove him or his candidacy, I don't think. And the dust-up he got in with Julian Castro about whether or not to decriminalize border entry from Mexico. That also did not look good because Castro had what was clearly the more liberal position, the more progressive position. You can make an argument that Beto's is probably more likely to go into policy, but during a Democratic debate, you don't necessarily want to be on the side of being conservative on immigration, especially when you have the specter of Donald Trump and his policies, what has been happening at the border, especially with the concentration camps and the recent tragedy on the Rio Grande. So I thought he didn't do well.
I would say that the Democrats overall had a really hard time answering the question. It was their great opportunity to show themselves to the people, and they took advantage of that by saying like, hey, this is why I'm running. They really didn't do a good job at answering the question, and I hope we get better at that with the debates. In terms of Beto, people were very excited when he announced, and along with the other candidates, very excited. The momentum was strong. People are excited about what's happening, but now we're getting closer and closer to like actually running the campaign in 2020, and I think people are getting a little more nervous, and we're saying like, okay, who will be our candidate?
Speaking of our candidate, did you see anyone on that stage who you thought could beat Donald Trump? I'm going to say, well, first, it's too early. At this point, Hillary Clinton led Donald Trump by about 15 or 16 points, and we saw how that worked out. But sometimes you can just kind of feel, you can get a sense of, who could be a strong contender and who might not be. And really, the only person there who I thought could maybe have a plausible case for defeating Donald Trump was Elizabeth Warren. Now, I personally don't think that she would beat Donald Trump at this current stage that we're at, because we are so polarized, and the president seems to understand maybe not politics, but the anger of voters in a way that I think is unique to him, and has not been matched by any other politician I've ever seen. But the way that she commanded the rest of the candidates, whenever she spoke, they all looked at her, no one really interrupted her. I thought that was powerful. It had gravitas, and I think that maybe she could win, but that was about it.
I agree. And so in terms of President Donald Trump, I was on the way here to the library. I was listening to NPR, and news today is that the Supreme Court blocked the 2020 census citizenship question in the setback for the Trump administration. But as I came, which we were excited that this citizenship question will not be on the census because it will be extremely limiting and it is unnecessary. But Trump is willing to wait until he gets his way, like he's done before, for the census to happen, which cannot happen. We need the census to be done per the Constitution every 10 years.
It's in there.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of things in there,
it.
But I think it's a reoccurring theme that Trump doesn't get his way and he wants to prolong things, like our longest government shutdown. But I think the greater question is, why is he and his administration pushing the citizenship question that, as I said, is unnecessary and doesn't do anything and is limiting?
Well, I think the obvious answer is that, and we found this, it was like a plot from a Hollywood movie. This Republican strategist died, and then his estranged daughter, found his files on the census, and pretty much he laid out that adding this question will end up helping Republicans when we redraw congressional districts, because with the census we count people, not voters, and so when you have places with a lot of young people or a population of undocumented people, that counts for more, and that's more congressional districts. And so you look at like New York or California, Texas, these places along the border that lean Democratic, you would expect that if you added this question, which has not been tested and we can only guess what the effects would be, some people have said 6 million people wouldn't be counted, that would definitely have an effect on representation for people living in those areas. And so the Supreme Court took in that evidence, and it was 5-4, which is still closer than it ought to have been, but
with Roberts coming down in his opinion.
But what we should watch out for is Justice Alito recently gave a decision where he essentially said that we shouldn't be, the court should not be constrained by precedent, which is probably worrisome for the last 230 years of jurisprudence. If we're not going to be constrained by precedent, that means anything is up on the table. So it really could just take one more Supreme Court justice to change things. And we're going to wrap up soon because we've had some tech things.
This is the first time going, and we've learned some things, and we'll make it better. And again, we have a lot to say, and we're glad you're listening, and it will be smoother from here on out.
So in the next month, keep your eyes on Brexit.
Brexit.
The UK will have a new prime minister.
It will. And I was reading the Time magazine edition of a couple weeks ago, mid-June, and it had a wonderful article, maybe not so wonderful, about how Brexit broke Britain. And
Yes.
it's just very interesting. I've had people ask who will be this prime minister, so that will be
Yes.
very interesting, and the international relations between us and the United States.
Some friends of mine have said that we may not be looking at the breakup of the EU, but maybe the breakup of Britain. We'll see. So there's a lot we didn't get to today, but next month it's going to be better.
Yes.
Or maybe in 2 weeks, probably next month. We haven't worked out a schedule quite
Yes,
yet.
but we're doing a lot of work for Civitas. Stay tuned to talking about the St. Louis City County consolidation. We're working a lot with empathy in politics. And if you have any suggestions of what you would like us to talk about or work or research or interview,
Leave a
please let
comment.
us know. Yes.
Leave a comment, send us an email. You can find our contact info at civitas-stl.com. And that's about it. I'm Reece.
I'm Maggie.
This has been Provel and Politics.